Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. We are jumping straight into something today that honestly influences literally every person on Earth.
It really does.
Yeah, it dictates where trillions of dollars in global capital are deployed, yet it's almost entirely hidden inside these highly specialized academic circles.
Right. The modeling community.
Exactly. Our mission today is to explore a fascinating and, frankly, an alarming question. What if the world's top computer models the exact frameworks that global leaders and massive corporations use to draft their climate policies? What if they're operating on fundamentally broken assumptions about the future of our energy system?
It is a massive structural question, and the entire conversation today is prompted by a rigorous new analysis that really pulls the curtain back on the architecture of these models.
Yeah, it does. We're pulling all our insights today from this single, incredibly detailed piece of research. Here's the official title: Navigating the Energy Transitions, Analysis of the Role of Renewable Energy and Electrification in IPCC AR6 Scenarios Reaching Safe Climate Conditions.
Quite a mouth.
It is a mouthful, yeah. So for the rest of this deep dive, we'll just refer to it as this study. But the hook here, the real realization we're going to unpack, is this idea that the central computer models guiding global climate policy are radically underestimating solar and wind power,
Radically.
while simultaneously relying on physically impossible amounts of biomass to balance their carbon ledgers.
Yeah, to grasp the scale of this disconnect, we really need to look at the machinery itself. We are talking about integrated assessment models, or IAMs. These are the engines behind the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
The IPCC.
Right, specifically feeding into their sixth assessment report, which is the AR6 database.
You know, the best way I can visualize these IAMs for you, the listener, is to imagine a massively complex, high-stakes game of SimCity, but for the entire planet's economy, energy grid, and climate system.
That is a remarkably accurate way to put it.
You input certain parameters, right?
Mm.
About technology, costs, capital, human behavior. And the model simulates how civilization might hit a specific climate target over the next century. But if your inputs are flawed,
Your entire simulated future is compromised,
Sure.
exactly. The researchers behind the study essentially audited 143 of these global SimCity scenarios from the AR6 database.
okay,
Specifically the ones that successfully target a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming limit. They wanted to see the actual mechanics of how these models achieve that safety threshold. Do they deploy the renewable technologies we are rapidly scaling today? Do they electrify heavy industry?
and the findings are, I mean, frankly, a massive reality check. The first major data point from this study completely threw me. Out of those 143 scenarios that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, only 30% project that primary renewable electricity will make up 55% or more of our energy demand by the year 2100.
Yeah, 30%.
That seems wildly out of sync with current market trends. I mean, we see solar and wind dominating new grid interconnections today, yet 70% of these top-tier climate models don't even see renewables crossing a 55% threshold by the end of the century.
It is a huge disconnect, and the study takes a very smart approach to dissecting why this is happening. The researchers categorize the models into archetypes based on their renewable energy deployment to figure out why the outputs are so wildly divergent.
So they essentially bucketed them by their level of optimism or perhaps realism regarding renewables.
That is one way to look at it, yeah. You have the low R models like coffee and image. In these simulations, renewable electricity remains a surprisingly marginal player in the future global energy mix.
Okay.
Then there are the medium R models like message. Finally, you have the high R models, with remind being the real standout there.
And Remind is the one that actually looks like the real world, right?
Arguably the most aligned with current market trajectories, yes. It shows renewable energy shares reaching up to almost 88% by 2050.
See, I am looking at the current installation rates of solar worldwide, and then I look at the image or coffee models. What is the internal logic there? Why would a model look at the energy landscape today and decide that solar and wind just aren't going to be a major factor 30 years from now?
It boils down to a failure to accurately model capital expenditures. CapEx.
Ah, the cost assumptions.
Exactly. The models projecting low renewable adoption are burdened by outdated, structurally pessimistic cost assumptions. In the physical world, we have witnessed unprecedented learning by doing cost reductions. Wright's law is in full effect.
Which means every time we double the global cumulative capacity of solar panels, the cost drops by a predictable percentage.
Right. But many of these models, particularly the older architectures in the low RE archetype, are fundamentally failing to capture those dynamic cost declines. If your algorithm insists a solar array in 2040 is going to cost 3 times more than it actually will, the model's optimization engine simply won't build it.
Wait, let's dig into that data layer for a second, because this study highlights some things in the raw reporting that border on the absurd.
Oh, the glitches.
Yeah, we aren't just talking about conservative estimates here. The researchers found severe reporting errors. For example, the image model literally listed $0 per kilowatt for solar PV in its data reporting. Is that a glitch or a deliberate methodological choice to effectively break the solar pathway in the simulation?
It points heavily toward a lack of rigorous quality control in the reporting of the input data, which is staggering when you consider the policy weight these models carry.
It is unbelievable.
You have $0 entries for solar, and on the flip side, some models project wildly inflated capital costs for electrolyzers, which is the core hardware for green hydrogen production. When you have foundational data inputs that are either missing, glitched, or entirely divorced from current market realities, the model's output becomes a fiction.
The contrast here gets even more baffling when you look at how these same models handle nuclear power. The study points out that many of these models assume the capital costs for nuclear power will remain flat or even decrease over the rest of the century.
Which is a complete violation of historical empirical evidence.
Right.
The nuclear sector has historically demonstrated what we call negative learning. Over the decades, nuclear power has actually gotten more expensive to deploy due to necessary safety regulations, supply chain complexities, massive cost overruns, and extending lead times.
So we have models artificially freezing or inflating the future cost of solar and electrolyzers technologies that are currently writing massive cost decline curves while simultaneously programming and cost reductions for nuclear, a technology that has empirically become more expensive the more we build it.
It is an astonishing level of institutional inertia.
It really is. It means the policy recommendations coming out of these models are skewed from line one of the code.
It creates an entirely alternate reality for policymakers, and this forces us to confront the structural consequences of that bad math.
Walk us through that.
Well, if the model's optimization engine refuses to build cheap solar and wind because of faulty CapEx inputs, it still has to solve the mathematical problem of keeping the planet under 1.5 degrees of warming. It has to find another way to balance the global carbon budget.
Right, which brings us to the massive pivot point of this whole analysis. This is the question for you listening right now. If these models aren't aggressively decarbonizing the grid with renewables, what exactly are they doing to hit that temperature target?
What models like Coffee and AIM do is default to the status quo of the fossil fuel industry, but with a massive speculative technological bandage.
Carbon capture.
Exactly. Because they fail to deploy renewables, they assume we keep burning fossil fuels for much longer, and they try to offset those ongoing emissions by relying heavily on carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS.
But the math of 1.5 degrees doesn't work if you just capture new emissions at the smokestack. You have to go net negative. The models have to actively draw down legacy carbon from the atmosphere.
That is the crux of it. To achieve those net negative emissions without transitioning the primary energy grid to renewables, these models lean to a terrifying degree on BCCS.
Bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration.
Yes.
Okay. Assuming our listeners are familiar with the basic mechanics of BCCS, you grow biomass to act as a carbon sponge, you burn it for energy, and then sequester the exhaust underground. What this study reveals about the scale of BCCS in these models is genuinely alarming. 97% of these 1.5 degree scenarios exceed the global sustainable bioenergy potential by the year 2100.
We need to contextualize what that 97% failure rate actually means in physical terms. Earth systems scientists have calculated a strict sustainable limit for how much bioenergy we can harvest globally without pushing the ecosystems into collapse. That planetary boundary is roughly 100 exajoules of energy per year.
For a sense of scale, what does 100 exajoules look like in the real world?
100 exajoules is roughly equivalent to the total comprehensive annual energy consumption of the entire United States. Everything from cars to factories to homes. That is the absolute maximum limit of energy we could theoretically extract from global biomass sustainably.
And what are the low renewable models demanding we extract?
Up to 530 exajoules by 2100.
They are casually projecting a requirement of more than 5 United States worth of energy crops.
Yes. More than 5 times the sustainable planetary limit.
The ecological implications of that are apocalyptic. To cultivate 530 exajoules of biomass, you weren't just talking about a few extra cornfields. You were talking about commandeering continent-sized tracts of arable land.
It is entirely unfeasible.
You would be putting the global energy system in direct, zero-sum competition with global food production. The sheer scale of deforestation, the catastrophic biodiversity collapse, the water depletion, it's essentially a scenario where we bulldoze the Earth's biosphere in a desperate mathematical attempt to save its climate.
It highlights the danger of letting an algorithm solve a carbon equation without imposing strict ecological boundary conditions. The model doesn't care about biodiversity. It just sees a cheap way to generate negative emissions on a spreadsheet. What makes this reliance on BECCS even more frustrating is that the models largely ignore the other major technological lever for carbon removal, which is direct air capture, or DACCS.
Right, the technological vacuums that pull carbon directly from the ambient air without needing to plant continents of monoculture crops. Why is DACCS missing from these models?
Out of 20 global models analyzed, only 6 even include direct air capture as an available technology.
Only 6.
Yes. The justification usually loops right back to those conservative cost assumptions. Because the modelers assume DACS will be prohibitively expensive, they just exclude it entirely. But by excluding it, they force the model to over-rely on an ecologically disastrous level of biomass farming.
This cascading series of blind spots is fascinating, because if they are ignoring direct air capture due to cost, and they are ignoring solar due to bad CapEx data, it makes perfect sense that this study found the models are completely whiffing on one of the most critical energy transitions happening right now.
Indirect electrification.
Yes, the power-to-X economy.
Yes, the power-to-X economy. The omission of power-to-X, or PTX, is perhaps the most glaring gap in the AR6 pathways. As we see renewable electricity generation scale, the marginal cost of that power drops to near zero during peak production hours. Power-X is the framework for utilizing that massive surplus of cheap, clean electricity to synthesize other essential fuels and chemicals.
Right, we aren't talking about plugging a container ship into a wall outlet.
No, of course not.
We are talking about using vast arrays of cheap solar to power electrolyzers, splitting water to produce green hydrogen, and then upgrading that hydrogen into e-ammonia or e-methanol for heavy shipping, or using the hydrogen directly to decarbonize heavy industry like steelmaking.
Exactly. Power-to-X is the bridge that allows us to decarbonize the sectors that cannot be easily solved with a lithium-ion battery. But this study reveals that PTX pathways are practically invisible in most of these models.
Let me guess. It goes right back to the CapEx assumptions.
It is a direct domino effect. If your model is hard-coded with the assumption that solar power will remain expensive, and it is hard-coded with the assumption that electrolyzers are exorbitantly costly, then the model mathematically concludes that green hydrogen will never be economically viable.
So it never builds it.
Right. Because it can't see cheap green hydrogen, it completely misses the power-to-X revolution. Therefore, it assumes heavy industry and shipping must continue burning fossil fuels, which requires more CCS, which requires more BECCS.
It is a closed-loop system of institutional pessimism. But what is incredible about this study is that it doesn't just critique the failure to model a 1.5-degree future accurately. It takes a massive swing and analyzes the ultimate safest planetary target. 1.0 degrees.
Yes. The scientific consensus is increasingly clear that even stabilizing at 1.5 degrees leaves humanity exposed to severe risks of crossing irreversible climate tipping points. Widespread coral reef mortality, accelerating ice sheet collapse, permafrost thawing.
All the terrifying stuff.
Exactly. The truly safe planetary boundary, which would return us to a stable, Holocene-like climate, is 1.0 degrees. That requires returning the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide to 350 parts per million.
Achieving 350 parts per million from where we are today is a monumental task. And according to the study, almost none of the models even bother to try. Only 8.5% of the moderate, middle-of-the-road scenarios even attempt to map a pathway to that 1.0 degree boundary.
The models that do attempt it provide a stark and revealing contrast. The study highlights two vastly different philosophical and technological approaches to human survival, embodied by two different models, message and remind.
Let's break down these two futures because the geopolitical implications are massive here. Let's start with the message model's pathway to 1.0 degrees.
To hit that aggressive target, the message model relies heavily on the concept of degrowth. It assumes that the only way to balance the math is to orchestrate a drastic systemic reduction in global energy demand and overall macroeconomic activity. And alongside that enforced degrowth, It scales up nuclear power and leans heavily on those massive, ecologically destructive biomass plantations we discussed earlier.
We really have to unpack what degrowth actually means in this context. It is a highly contentious concept. If you tell the industrialized West to use less energy, that is one thing. But enforcing global energy degrowth essentially means telling developing nations across the global South that they cannot scale their economies, they cannot build out their infrastructure, and they cannot reach the living standards of the West.
It is a pathway fraught with massive social and geopolitical friction.
Absolutely. It demands a level of global behavioral change and economic contraction that many argue is politically impossible and socially unjust.
Yeah.
But then the study contrasts that with the pathway mapped out by the Remind model.
Right. And Remind is the model that actually has realistic modern inputs for renewable energy costs.
Exactly. Because Remind accurately models the falling capex of solar, wind, and batteries, its optimization engine finds a completely different route to 1.0 degrees. It doesn't rely on global economic contraction. Instead, it builds its way out of the crisis.
It models a rapid deployment of renewables, achieving near 100% clean primary energy, and it utilizes massive electrification and power-to-X technologies to clean up industry.
It is an abundance mindset versus a scarcity mindset.
Precisely. The Remind pathway proves that if you use accurate real-world cost data for renewables, you can achieve the strictest, safest climate target without forcing global degrowth and without destroying the biosphere with impossible amounts of biomass farming. From a sustainability, ecological, and societal standpoint, the study makes it clear that this high renewable pathway is vastly superior.
This is exactly why we wanted to do this deep dive today. We spent a lot of time analyzing model names, CapEx assumptions, and the mechanics of AR6 scenarios. Let's bring all of this directly back to you, the listener. Why does the internal architecture of the Remind or Coffee models matter to your life or to your business?
It is about knowing what is actually driving the decisions.
Exactly. When you read a policy briefing or you see a massive multinational corporation announce their multi-billion-dollar net zero by 2050 strategy, you now have the context to look under the hood. To ask the foundational question, is this strategy built on the reality of the rapidly deploying incredibly cheap solar, wind, and battery technologies we have today? Or is this policy secretly relying on a dusty computer model's fantasy, where we maintain fossil fuel infrastructure and mathematically offset it by planting 5 United States worth of bioenergy crops?
That is the ultimate utility of this research. It is a call for transparency. The study rigorously demonstrates that the scientific and policy communities urgently need to update their cost assumptions to reflect the reality of the energy transition. They must integrate power-to-X pathways, and they need to impose strict ecological limits on biomass in their simulations. If our global maps are wrong, we cannot navigate to a safe, credible future.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. We've just spent this time exploring how the world's most sophisticated, supercomputer-driven climate models, which guide global summits and trillion-dollar investments, are lagging years, sometimes decades, behind the physical, real-world reality of solar and battery cost curves.
It's sober.
It begs a highly provocative question. If our most elite predictive frameworks can be this blind to something as tangible, measurable, and easily verifiable as the price of a solar panel, what other rapid societal, economic, or technological shifts are our policymakers currently ignoring? If the simulation can't keep up with the speed of the energy transition, what else is moving faster than the models can handle? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into navigating the energy transitions, analysis of the role of renewable energy and electrification in IPCC AR6 scenarios reaching safe climate conditions.